On a scorching Sunday afternoon in Phoenix, Nancy stood at the front door of her parents' house, gripping a bottle of wine she had brought for their usual weekend family dinner. The dry desert wind rustled through her shoulder-length brown hair as she wiped beads of sweat from her forehead. Her parents' house, standing dignified among the neatly lined palm trees of the upscale Paradise Valley neighborhood, had always been a symbol of their carefully maintained social status. She let out a deep sigh before ringing the doorbell, already bracing herself for what lay ahead. Her mother, Susan, opened the door with an air of practiced elegance, wearing impeccable makeup and a sophisticated dress as if posing for a social media photo. Behind her, the large windows framed a picturesque view of the desert-style garden, another perfectly curated aspect of their lives. "You're late. Everyone's been waiting." "Linda and her family are already here," her mother remarked, her tone carrying the same underlying judgment Nancy had come to expect. Nancy forced a smile, muttered an apology, and stepped inside, removing her shoes as was customary. The moment her feet touched the plush Persian carpet, a familiar sense of detachment settled over her. The living room walls were adorned with carefully arranged family photographs, her parents' wedding, childhood snapshots of Nancy and her sister Linda, framed graduation pictures, and, most prominently, a chronological display of Linda's daughter Sarah, from infancy to present day. Each image, meticulously staged and composed, told the story of a perfect family, or at least, the illusion of one. From the white leather sofa, Linda waved with an effortless grace that had always come naturally to her. She sat beside her 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, gently combing the child's long hair with absent-minded care. Next to them, her husband Greg sat comfortably, dressed in an expensive brand-name polo, his perfectly styled hair giving him the appearance of someone who had just stepped out of a luxury magazine. "Hey, Nancy," he greeted casually, barely glancing up from his phone. Their father, David, remained seated in his usual armchair, engrossed in his newspaper. Even in retirement, he maintained the air of a teacher observing his students from behind his reading glasses. A brief nod was the only acknowledgement he offered to his eldest daughter. Conversation at the table soon turned into the usual praise for Linda's accomplishments. Their mother beamed as she spoke about Linda's latest endeavor, attending a high-end yoga studio where Hollywood celebrities had once trained. "The membership fee is steep, but it suits Linda perfectly," Susan declared with pride. Her father agreed with a measured nod. "Our younger daughter is so ambitious, so devoted to family and community. She never misses a church event." Nancy listened in silence, sipping her wine. She knew, without a doubt, that her recent promotion at the accounting firm and her major success with a high-profile client would never be mentioned. In this house, her achievements were invisible, just like she had always been. The sun had barely risen over Phoenix when Nancy joined her family for breakfast at Morning Glory, a well-known restaurant with a beautifully arranged outdoor terrace. The choice of venue had been her mother's idea. Susan always preferred locations that reflected their family's prestige, and the terrace, though less crowded, provided the perfect setting for an aesthetically pleasing morning. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows, casting a golden glow over the table as the aroma of expertly prepared eggs Benedict filled the air. Everything looked picturesque, as if staged for a magazine shoot. As Nancy took a sip of her coffee, Linda leaned forward with a smile, her voice laced with feigned concern. "Sis, did you remember to bring your passport?" Nancy frowned slightly at the question. "Of course. I double-checked everything last night," she replied, her tone neutral. "Oh, good. I almost forgot mine once," Linda laughed lightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Susan eyed Nancy's bag, a sleek, expensive leather purse she had splurged on after her latest promotion. "That new bag is lovely," her mother commented, her voice carrying an almost imperceptible hint of something more. Nancy excused herself to use the restroom, setting her bag on the chair beside her. As she walked away, she had no reason to suspect anything unusual. The restaurant's security cameras, however, would later reveal everything. Her mother, calmly sipping her coffee, casting a quick glance around before reaching into Nancy's bag with well-practiced precision. In a mere 10 seconds, her passport disappeared into Susan's handbag. Across the table, Linda exchanged a fleeting, knowing smile with their mother. By the time Nancy returned, everything appeared normal. The conversation drifted back to small talk, and despite an unsettling feeling in the back of her mind, she dismissed it as nothing. The unease, however, grew stronger at the airport. As her family moved through the check-in line, she unzipped her bag to retrieve her passport. At first, she searched calmly, but as her fingers combed through the contents without success, her heart began to race. Her mother's voice rang out, smooth and composed. "Is something wrong?" Nancy swallowed hard, her hands shaking slightly. I can't find my passport." Linda gasped dramatically. "Oh no, sis. You must have left it somewhere. How careless." A soft chuckle escaped their mother's lips as she covered her mouth with a delicate hand. "Well, you can't come then, can you?" Nancy's breath caught in her throat. The weight of realization crashed over her. This wasn't a mistake. It had been planned. Her father gave an indifferent snort. "That's that," he muttered, as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. "We'll be going ahead," her mother said breezily, turning back to the airline staff. Nancy stared, frozen in place, as her family walked away without her. Their laughter, their nonchalance, their absolute certainty that she wouldn't fight back at all, cut deeper than she had ever imagined. Only Sarah, her 8-year-old niece, looked back with wide, confused eyes, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. Nancy clenched her fists. She would never forget this moment. And she would never let them get away with it. The shock of betrayal had long passed by the time Nancy arrived at Morning Glory later that morning. Now, all that remained was determination. As she pulled into the parking lot, her reflection in the rearview mirror caught her eye. Her dark circles betrayed a sleepless night, but her gaze was sharp, unwavering. At 11:00 a.m., the restaurant was in the lull between breakfast and lunch, with only a few scattered patrons. The air smelled of fresh coffee and buttered toast, but Nancy had no appetite. She walked straight to the front counter, her voice steady. "Is the manager available?" A woman in her late 40s, with a warm yet observant gaze, emerged from the back. "I'm Janet Morrison, the manager. How can I help you?" Taking a deep breath, Nancy explained her situation: her missing passport, her family's sudden departure, and the calculated betrayal she had just endured. Though she kept her voice calm, there was a slight tremor when she finally said, "I believe my mother took it. I need to check the security footage." Janet's friendly expression tightened. "Security footage is confidential without a warrant." Nancy was prepared for this. "I understand. But this is a case of passport theft, a federal crime. I'm willing to involve the police if necessary." The mention of legal action changed Janet's stance. Her eyes flickered with recognition at the mention of the Walker family. They were well-known figures in Paradise Valley. After a long pause, she nodded. "Follow me." In the small security room, Nancy stood in silence as the blue-tinted footage played out on the screen. There it was, the moment her mother had slipped a hand into her bag and retrieved the passport with eerie ease. Her sister Linda's knowing smile. Her father's indifferent posture, buried behind his newspaper. Even little Sarah, tilting her head in innocent confusion, unaware of the silent betrayal unfolding before her. The evidence was undeniable. I need a copy of this, Nancy said firmly, snapping pictures on her phone while taking down notes on the timestamps. Janet exhaled sharply. I'll save the footage in case you need it for the police. Nancy gave a tight nod. Thank you. The next stop was the Phoenix Police Department. Officer Thompson, a seasoned officer with a knowing gaze, listened intently as Nancy laid out her case. I have the restaurant's security footage, she said, unlocking her phone. I also recorded my family's conversations from this morning. You'll hear them discussing my supposed promise to pay for the vacation then at the airport, my mother's words. We'll be going with just the real family. Officer Thompson took notes, nodding. This is serious. Passport theft, especially tied to international travel, can carry heavy consequences. Nancy pressed her lips together. I want justice, but, my niece, Sarah, she's innocent in all this. I don't want her to suffer. The officer's gaze softened. We'll keep all options open, including a settlement. The key is how you use the time before they return. As she left the station, Nancy felt a new sense of control. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her power. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to fight back. The lights of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport had long faded into the distance by the time Nancy arrived at the Ritz-Carlton. From her suite's balcony, she gazed out over the city skyline, the desert heat lingering even as night settled in. Below, the traffic moved steadily, the world carrying on as if nothing had happened. But for Nancy, everything had changed. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. Linda's name flashed across the screen, followed by a barrage of unread messages. 20 missed calls. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened her laptop. The plan was already in motion. By morning, a formal police report had been filed, with copies of her recorded conversations and the restaurant's security footage secured as evidence. Officer Thompson had assured her that steps were being taken. But Nancy wasn't one to sit back and wait. She spent the next 7 days meticulously planning. Legal preparations, financial adjustments, career considerations, everything had to be in place before her family returned. The silence from her parents was telling. The few messages she had received were transparent attempts at damage control. Her mother's email had been particularly patronizing. My beloved daughter, I only wanted you to reflect a little. You always put family last. Nancy had deleted it without hesitation. The truth was clear now. She had never been a part of their perfect little world. She had only been tolerated until she refused to play along. The day of reckoning arrived under the glow of a full moon. At 11:00 p.m., 2 unmarked police cars idled in front of her parents' house in Paradise Valley. The neighborhood's usual tranquility was broken by the hushed whispers of onlookers, silhouettes shifting behind curtained windows. The walker's fall from grace was already a spectacle. Inside one of the vehicles, Nancy sat in silence. The week away had given her clarity. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to reclaim her life. Taxis crossing city limits, Officer Thompson reported over the radio. They'll be entering through the main gate shortly. Nancy adjusted the collar of her navy blue suit, the sharp professionalism of the fabric grounding her. Years of endurance had led to this moment. At 11:15 p.m., headlights illuminated the driveway. Linda emerged first, her designer sundress and sun-kissed tan evidence of their luxury vacation. She looked as flawless as ever except for the flicker of nervousness in her eyes. Their mother followed, maintaining an air of dignity despite the tension in her posture. Her handbag, The very one that had once concealed Nancy's stolen passport, trembled slightly in her grasp. Their father was last, silently unloading suitcases. His meticulous nature remained, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed him. Finally, Sarah, the only innocent in this mess, stepped out of the car, clutching a stuffed animal to her chest. Her wide eyes darted between the waiting officers, confusion evident. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," Officer Thompson's voice cut through the night air. "We'd like to discuss a case of passport theft." Her mother's expression froze, all traces of her usual poise evaporating. "Is something wrong?" her father asked, his voice tight. Nancy stepped out of the police car, her silhouette striking under the streetlights. She met her mother's gaze, unflinching. "Yes," Nancy said, her voice unwavering. "Let's talk." 3 months had passed since that night in Paradise Valley, but Nancy could still remember every detail the way her mother's carefully curated facade had cracked, the moment her father's silent authority had withered, and Linda's anguished cries as years of jealousy spilled out in front of an indifferent legal system. The settlement had been swift. Nancy had agreed not to press criminal charges in exchange for a financial settlement, $5 million wired to her account. A sum meant to sever all ties, to buy silence, to make her disappear from their lives. But money couldn't erase the damage. Her parents, once well-respected figures in their affluent community, had been forced to leave. Paradise Valley had no room for scandals. The whispers had spread too quickly, social media had done its work, and within weeks, their names were nothing more than a stain on polite conversation. Her father, David, resigned from all honorary education board positions, his once pristine reputation as a former teacher now tarnished. Newspapers had vaguely reported on a former educator's family entangled in a scandal, but the message was clear: he had lost the respect of his peers. Her mother, Susan, lost something even greater: her social standing. With her carefully cultivated friendships in ruins, she had no choice but to relocate to a small suburban town, far from the country club brunches and exclusive charity galas that had once defined her. The loss of status was a heavier blow than any legal punishment could have been. And then there was Linda. Her perfect world had collapsed. Therapy sessions 3 times a week were now routine, as she struggled to face the resentment that had festered for years. She had withdrawn from her once lavish social life. Her Instagram, once flooded with staged family photos and yoga retreat snapshots, had gone silent. Her husband, Greg, had taken notice. The cracks in their marriage were no longer hidden behind curated online perfection. With her public downfall, his own reputation in the real estate industry had plummeted. Divorce loomed on the horizon, and with it, the last vestiges of her illusion of control. But the worst casualty of all was Sarah. The innocent 8-year-old, caught in the storm of adult failures, had been sent to live with her paternal grandparents. Nancy knew it wasn't a stable home. Arguments were frequent, and the tension of the situation weighed heavily on the young girl. And yet, through it all, Nancy had found something unexpected: freedom. She had left Phoenix behind, accepting a position at a prestigious firm in Chicago. Her new office overlooked Lake Michigan, the vast, open waters, a stark contrast to the suffocating desert landscape she had known all her life. She was thriving. Partnership was already within reach. On weekends, she walked along the shoreline, the crisp wind brushing against her skin. The past still lingered, but it no longer controlled her. One evening, a letter arrived. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but unmistakably Sarah's. "Dear Auntie, Mommy still isn't well, but I want to be strong like you. Please wait for me. Someday, when I grow up." Tears welled in Nancy's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. Holding the letter to her chest, she looked out at the glowing city skyline. For the first time in her life, she was truly free. The sky over Chicago stretched endlessly above Nancy as she stood on the balcony of her high-rise apartment, gazing down at the shimmering lights of the city below. The view was nothing like Phoenix, the desert heat, the palm-lined streets, and the suffocating familiarity of Paradise Valley had been replaced by towering buildings, the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, and the thrilling anonymity of a fresh start. It had been 3 months since she had severed all ties with her family. 3 months since she had sat in that grand living room, watching her mother's elegant mask crack as the security footage played. 3 months since she had walked away, not as the outcast daughter, but as a woman in control of her own destiny. Now, the past felt like a distant memory, something she had once lived through but no longer carried. Her days were filled with work, challenging, fulfilling, and demanding in all the right ways. At her new firm, her skills were not just recognized but actively sought after. Partnership was already on the horizon, a milestone she never could have reached had she stayed in Phoenix, where she was constantly weighed down by invisible expectations. She no longer had to dim her own accomplishments to accommodate someone else's insecurities. No more Linda flashing a rehearsed smile while subtly undermining her success. No more Susan reminding her that family comes first whenever she dared to put herself ahead of their demands. No more David, silently observing from behind a newspaper, offering neither approval nor affection. And yet, despite the clarity and relief, there were still remnants of the past she couldn't quite shake. One of them arrived in the form of a small envelope, postmarked from Phoenix. Inside, in shaky, uneven handwriting, was a letter from Sarah. Dear Auntie Nancy, Mommy still isn't well, but I want to be strong like you. I miss you. Please wait for me. Someday, when I grow up. Nancy felt her breath hitch as she read the words, her niece's innocent plea cutting through all the walls she had built around herself. Of all the casualties from that night, Sarah was the one she had worried about most. The child had been thrown into the chaos of adult failures, caught between a mother unraveling under the weight of her own insecurities and a father who was already considering an escape. Nancy had done what she could. She had stayed in touch, arranging video calls whenever possible, offering warmth and stability from a distance. But it wasn't enough. She folded the letter carefully, placing it in a drawer where she kept the few things that truly mattered. Sarah's love was unconditional. That was something her own parents had never given her. A gust of wind swept through the balcony, rustling her hair. Below, the city pulsed with life. She had built something new here, something that belonged solely to her. And yet, as she looked out over the skyline, she knew her story wasn't finished. One day, Sarah would find her way out too. And when that time came, Nancy would be waiting,